So what I'm going to do is start at the beginning. And in the beginning in this instance is 1866, when the Linguistic Society of Paris banned all discussion of the evolution of language. They said the society does not accept papers on either the origin of language or the invention of a universal language, and the London Philological Society followed suit in 1872. And they decided that these papers were not worth having because they thought they were drivel, and many too many of them. So the topic was just not worth investigating. Now, 150 years later, I have a study that might make these societies change their minds. Now, I say might in part because the language I'm talking about not only isn't French, but it isn't even a spoken language. So, to begin, we're going to go back to the very beginning, which is probably the earliest study of the resilience of human language, which is described by Herodotus in 429 BC. It's got to be the earliest study. He talks about an argument between the Egyptian and Phrygian kings. And because these guys were kings, they were arguing over which was the original language. And because they were kings, the only languages they considered were Egyptian and Phrygian. But somewhat surprisingly for kings, they decided this debate not by battle, not by edict, but by experiment. So what they did was they took two children and put them in the custody of a shepherd and told the shepherd that he could feed them, water them, be nice to them, love them, but never to speak to them. No utterances at all. They waited around for about a year, year and a half, visited the children, and they found that both children produced the word bakos, which means bread in Phrygian. And that's where the matter has lasted for all of these years. So, you know, even before the IRB got serious about how we conduct our studies, this study was not an easy study to replicate experimentally. Honestly, parents are not so happy about giving us their children so we can deprive them of linguistic input. It's hard to understand. But we can actually take advantage of an experiment of nature where children are sort of naturally lacking linguistic input. And then we can ask, can such a child reinvent language? So now the big problem here, of course, is who doesn't have linguistic input? Everybody's got linguistic input. But there are children who have linguistic input, but they can't make use of it. So there are deaf children whose hearing losses are so profound that they can't make use of the sea of spoken language that surrounds them, even with hearing aids, and these studies were done way before there were cochlear implants. In addition, these deaf children are born to hearing parents, and their hearing parents could have exposed them to a sign language, but they didn't know one, and so they didn't expose the kids to a sign language. So for all intents and purposes, these children are lacking linguistic input. They have speech that they can't make use of, and they don't have sign, which they could make use of. So what do? I mean, one might think that they'd sit in a corner and play marbles by themselves, but in fact what they do is communicate. And they turn to gesture to communicate, and those gestures are called home signs. So what I'd like to do first is just to give you an example of a home signer, a deaf child born to hearing parents in the United States. This is a child sitting in front of a Richard Scarry book, which for those of you who know the literature is the best word book ever. It's really a good book. He's sitting in front of the book. He points at the picture of a shovel stuck in sand. And what he does is he goes and he tells us about that. He says, you can shovel. And then he starts to get an idea to tell a little story. He talks about the fact that these shovels, you can use snow shovels. When it snows and when you put on your boots, the shovels are used outside, but they're kept downstairs. It's a whole little story that he's telling us with his hands. Here it goes.
Shovel, shovel.
Now in the winter time.
Oh, yeah, it's a good
shovel in the winter time. Yeah, yes.
Outside?
When it's snowing.
Oh, when it's snowing. You got a shovel.
Snowing, yeah.
Right. Oh, I see. Where's the shovel?
Where is it? It's in the garage.
There it is.
There.
Downstairs. Oh, there's the shovel. Oh, good.
So this work was done collaboratively with Lila Gleitman and Heidi Feldman, and Heidi is the person in the videotape patting this child on the back. So home signs do not just erupt in the United States, they're found all over the world. And here's another example of a deaf child born to hearing parents in China. She's looking at exactly the same book, but she's picked out a different page to focus on. It's a picture of a swordfish. And what she says with her hands is that the swordfish can pierce you through the heart, and make you dead. This turns out to be a gesture. It's not a sign. It's a gesture that hearing people use. It's like an emblem, like we do thumbs up and okay, which are a little opaque. This is a gesture that means dead, and the child has learned it. Pierce you through the heart, make you dead. It has a long nose, and it swims. Then after she says this, her little hearing sister walks in front of her, and to show you sort of how versatile this gesturing is, what she says is it can pierce you through the heart and make you dead. Sibling rivalry.
死掉啦！真的啊？死掉啊！真的，鱼刺。他说的是一个大的，不晓得什么鱼。这个，他说他鼻子尖尖的，妈妈死掉了，眼睛。
So we usually count a gesture as a gesture only if it isn't a functional act in the real world, and that gesture is just on the border because it was produced a little harder than it needed to be to represent piercing through the heart. Okay, so these children they're clearly communicating. There's no question, nobody can deny that they're communicating. Is that communication language? Well, my colleagues and I have actually spent 40 years trying to ask that question, and what we've done is identify many of the properties that are found in natural language in home sign. We found properties at the sentence level of analysis, at the word level, and in terms of language use. And I'll just give you a few examples of that. So here's an example of a child. He's asking me to have a snack. And what he does is he points at the snack, he does an eat gesture, and then he points at me. So, grape, eat, you. And the interesting thing about this is that he continues to use this order, not just in this instance, but whenever he's talking about objects and actions and agents. So here it goes. Okay. Grape, eat, you. Okay. Words in home sign are stable and can differ across cultures. So you just saw an example of what a deaf kid of hearing parents in America, a home signer, would do for eat. Here he is again. In China, they also do that, but there is another gesture that they use which you might have guessed, and that is this. Right? Culturally appropriate. Okay. So, in addition, I think a child would never invent a language to talk to themselves. But once you've invented a language to talk to someone else, these deaf children will use that sign system to talk to themselves. And here's an example of that. The child is sitting next to his sister, gets up, he's looking for something. He's playing with clay, and he's looking for a plastic knife. And he gets up and he does a where gesture to his side, and then he points at himself. And the important thing to notice is that he's not making eye contact with anybody. This is really directed at him. Okay, so he's up, getting up, where, pointing at himself, and no eye contact. This is communication really with himself. Okay, so one of the things that you may be wondering, I suspect you are, is whether these deaf children really invented these home sign systems, these gestures, or whether their hearing parents did it. They're interacting with hearing parents all the time. Their hearing parents are talking to them all the time. And of course, they're gesturing because we all gesture. So maybe it's the hearing parents who invented the system and the children are learning that, which would be interesting, but not nearly as interesting as if the deaf children are inventing it themselves. So what we did to explore this question was to focus on two structural properties found in home sign, which we're going to look at in Nicaragua and in the United States. One is a complex sentence where you have two propositions, two ideas embedded under the single sentence node. So before he drops his hands, he describes two ideas. Let me give you an example of a Nicaraguan home signer producing a complex sentence. What he does, points at an object, bean, does a cut gesture, points at an object, tomatoes, and does an eat gesture. And both of those are produced before he drops his hands. So that's a complex sentence. Complex noun phrases, what he does is combine two gestures that are used to refer to a single element in the sentence, and that's embedded underneath the sentence node. So it's a slightly different structure. Here goes. He says airplane, or he gestures airplane, and then points at himself, mine, and then says it's over there. So airplane mine is over there. Okay, airplane mine is over there. Okay, and these are very simple sentences, but they do have structure. One has, there are two sentence nodes embedded under a single sentence node, or one is where the noun phrase is embedded under the sentence. So they have structure. The question is, did the children introduce this structure, or did the parents? So to find out, we looked at the gestures that the home signers' hearing families in the United States and Nicaragua produced while interacting with the kids. And we analyzed those gestures exactly as we analyzed the deaf kids' gestures. So in fact, we turned off the sound and we just watched what the parents do, because that's what the kids do. They can't hear any of this stuff. So we're going to analyze these gestures as though they were a deaf child's gesture. And what we found, this is work done with Molly Flaherty and Dea Hunsiger, what we found is that the home signers produced many more of these structured gesture sentences than their hearing families. So let me walk you through this. On the left side, you see the data from the Nicaraguan families, the right side from the United States. The home signers are in red. The hearing family members, which includes parents, cousins, aunts, uncles, anybody who's around. And in Nicaragua, a lot of people are around. The blue hearing families are in blue, and what you see is that in both instances, in both cultures, the home signers produce more gestures, more of these complex sentences than the hearing family members do. And it's even more striking when we look at complex noun phrases. Again, Nicaragua, United States. What's interesting about the United States is that the home signers produce a fair number of these, and the hearing moms never produce them, not once. So it does suggest that the deaf children are coming up with these structures. There's a lot of variability, though, and some of the mothers produce a lot of these things, and some produce very few. And some of the kids produce a lot, and some produce very few. So if the kids are really learning this from the parents, what we expected is that mothers who produce a lot of these things would have kids who produce a lot of these things, and mothers who produce very few of them would have kids who produce very few of them. So we should find this nice, neat, linear relationship between what the parents do and what the kids do. But in fact, what we find is that there's no relationship between what the individual home signers' gestures are and what the hearing family members' gestures are. So here, what we see for complex sentences, on the x-axis, I have the hearing family members, how many complex sentences they produce. On the y-axis, the home signers, and that nice, neat, linear pattern is just not there. It basically is mush. And it's even more striking, as you might expect, with the noun phrases, because all the mothers are at 0. But even for the Nicaraguan mothers, the ones who produce a lot of these things, their kids aren't the ones who produce a lot of these things. So what this suggests is that home signers, it's the home signers that are inventing the rudiments of language without any linguistic input from a conventional language model. But how far can these home signers go toward inventing a full-fledged language? It's a question that we wanted to ask, and that the situation in Nicaragua, where we've been studying home signers, allows us to act, because sign languages grow out of home sign. That's where all sign languages come from. And in Nicaragua, we now have the opportunity to watch a new language grow. So I've been talking about home signers. Home signers are very interesting and special. They have a very odd communicative situation, because what they're doing is they're producing this structured linguistic system with their hands. But what they get back from their parents is co-speech gesture, which is sort of the mushy stuff that I'm producing here. It looks very different. So they're producers of the system, but they're not receivers of the system. And that's a very odd communicative situation. So that's a home signer. But what happens, in fact, what happened in Nicaragua 35 years ago is that home signers were brought together for the very first time in an educational setting. It was a school for the deaf. Now, unfortunately, the deaf children learned very little in this school, almost nothing. But what the school did was give the children the opportunity to interact with one another. So what we have then is the home signers producing gestures, their own home signs, and getting in return home signs from someone else. So you can have, here now, a negotiated system. It's really sort of still creation, but it's creation with friends. And that might change the system dramatically. And then what happens now is that new deaf children are brought into the situation, and they learn that system, that's the cohort 1 system, from them and perhaps in the process change it. So what we're interested in exploring is what are the rudiments? What can children bring to the situation on their own, basically without any help? And where do they fall off? And when they fall off, can creating with friends help? Or is it necessary to have transmission across generations? So this work I'm doing collaborative, with Marie Coppola and Leisha Spappin. What we were interested in doing is looking at first, I'm going to give you an example of one of the properties of language that we've explored in this way. We're exploring many. But we've looked at indicating more than one. And what the people do when they indicate 3 cups, this is not a surprise, you would do exactly the same, we know because we've asked hearing people, is they do the following. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, 3. Bum, bum, bum. Discrete repetition to indicate 3. But the home signers actually do they do another way to indicate the plural. And what they do is something like this. Bum, 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 bum. It's much more fluid, it's much less discrete, and it's more sort of a single act. Okay, here's an example. Now what's interesting about this fluid act that he's doing it here for 3 cups, but he can use that for 14 cups, 11 cups, 10 cups, even 2 cups. What's interesting, even for 2, he would do something like this, just not for 1. So it really looks like it's a marker for the plural. Okay, so how is this marker used, and is it used in the same way? This work is with Laura Horton and Diane Brentari, and we are looking at how the plural is used in 2 different contexts. Either in a context where the objects are just sitting there, no agent at all, nobody's doing anything, or in a context where an agent puts the pens down, as in this situation. And she puts down a lot of pens, but we don't have to do them all. Okay, so what we looked at is we looked at how these 2 different forms of plurals were used in the 3 different groups: Home Sign, Nicaraguan Sign Language 1, and Nicaraguan Sign Language 2. This is in a no-agent context, and you see all of them use both forms. No problem, no difference. It's really interesting. But where it really gets tricky here is when you look at the agent trials. Because when we look at the agent trials, the home signers don't use that plural when they're talking about putting objects down, a bunch of objects down. We know they know it, they just don't do it. And in fact, you find the same constraint and the same restriction in Nicaraguan Sign Language Cohort 1. But interestingly, Nicaraguan Sign Language 2 is perfectly happy to use that plural form in an agent context. So what this suggests here is that it's only when home sign is transmitted to the next generation, when it's learned by a new set of minds, that the plural marker is generalized. And what we're interested in doing is finding out which properties of language home signers can invent and which properties of language can only be introduced into language when it is transmitted from one generation to the next. Okay, so home sign gives us a window into the properties of language that are so resilient they can be reinvented by a child. These are basically the properties that humans bring to language. We can see them. Home sign provides us with a lens to see them. The emergence of Nicaraguan Sign Language from home sign gives us a window onto the factors that make language grow into the very complex system that and grow beyond the resilient properties of language. Okay. So I hope I've convinced you thus far that language is resilient. When it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands. But I also, in the process of studying these home signers, I ended up having to look at gesture as well, because these are deaf children of hearing parents. The input to these children is co-speech gesture. So we had to start studying co-speech gesture in order to know what their input was. And in doing so, we found some interesting things about gesture. So let me give you an example of gesture. This is a woman who was asked by Janet Iverson to just describe how she gets from one place to another place. Listen to her and watch her hands.
We go left and then out to 3rd, and then up to Jordan, then right again, and we go straight up to 10th Street, but we turn right on 10th. So Jordan is actually, which would be like right here, it's behind us instead of crossing into the library. Mm-hmm. So we go right, and then we cross a driveway, which is to right quad, and then cross a street called Sunrise, and then Ashton is we keep going a little bit further, and Ashton, you turn right to get to Ashton.
Okay.
So There's nothing interesting and unique about her gestures, but as I'm sure you've all noticed, there's something quite interesting about her, and that is that she's blind. But even more interesting, she's congenitally blind. She has never ever seen anybody gesture. What is she doing gesturing when she's talking? It must be the case that these gestures are sort of tied to the speech that we produce, and when we produce speech for free, out come these gestures with our hands. Gesture is resilient too. So one big question that we started to ask is whether gestures are anything more than hand waving. And it turns out that we've discovered gesture reflects what we know. It can give you substantive information about what we know and can even change what we know. And to do this, we went back to a paradigm that was first used by Jean Piaget, the famous developmental psychologist. What Piaget did was, who actually I studied with when I did my junior year abroad at Smith College, which is sort of exciting. So what Piaget did, my roots, is set up 2 rows of checkers, and he made sure that the children knew that there's the same number of checkers in the first row and then the second row, and then he trickily spread one out. Okay? And then he said, are they the same number of checkers or not? And he discovered that many children before a certain age of 7, say, it's totally different. It's a totally different number, which is really shocking to parents. What Piaget was interested in is the way in which children explain that effect, that non-conservation. Interestingly, Piaget was probably the best observer of children in the world, but he missed it. He missed something, because he never once noted that children gesture when giving these explanations. And in fact, we've never found a kid who didn't gesture when talking about conservation. So here's an example of a child, a non-conserver, who is saying they're different. She's convinced. And she says they're different because you spreaded them out. And she says spread it out, and she does a spreading out gesture.
Like this. Do these 2 rows of checkers have the same number of checkers? No. Which row has more checkers in it? Now, why does that have more checkers in it?
You spread them apart and this one stay like you put them down.
Okay, so she's produced what we've come to call a gesture-speech match, because she's saying with her hands pretty much the same information that she's producing with her mouth, spreading out in both gesture and speech. Compare her to this one. This is a child who also thinks they're different, convinced. He says they're different because you moved them. But what he does with his hands is he does this. That's pretty clever, right? Because if you want to establish the sameness, it's the fact that there are 2 rows are the same, you do one-to-one correspondence between the checkers. He's doing that with his hands, meanwhile saying it's different.
Do our rows have the same number of checkers in them now? Why is there a different number in all those?
Because you moved them.
Okay.
So he's produced what we've been calling a gesture-speech mismatch. He says, because you moved him with his mouth, but with his hands he produces a totally different strategy, one-to-one correspondence. When we discovered these kids, Greggy Church was the first one to discover them, we thought, maybe they know something different from the children who match. And in order to find out, we took children, none of whom knew how to solve this problem, and gave them instruction to see who would profit from instruction. And what I'm going to show you in this next slide is who learned after instruction. What you see here is the white bars represent children who are matchers prior to instruction. The blue bar represents children who are mismatchers prior to instruction. And the x-axis just gives you the percentage of children who improved after instruction. As you can see, mismatchers were much more likely to improve than matchers were. So they're more ready to learn. And we can tell that by looking at their gestures. Notice you can't tell it by listening to them. They're saying exactly the same thing. It's only their gestures that give you a cue that these kids are ready to learn. So maybe this is just about conservation. So we decided to look at another problem. This study was done by Michelle Perry and Martha Ali-Bali. We looked at a math problem, pretty easy. 3 plus 4 plus 5 equals blank plus 5. The bad news is that 4th and 5th graders, particularly in the Chicago public schools, actually can't solve this problem. And when they fail to solve this problem, what they do is either they add up all the numbers on the left side of the equal sign and they put that number in the blank, or they add up all of the numbers in the whole problem and they put that number in the blank. But as we all know, even though it's late in the day, I'm pretty sure you know, that 7 is the right answer, and you can get it by adding the 3 and the 4 and putting that number in the blank. Okay, so again, here's an example of a child who said she added the 5 and the 4 and the 3 in her hands and in her mouth. She points at the 5 and the 4 and 3 and says 5, 4, 3. Here she goes.
How did you get 12? Is your answer?
Okay, so she's produced a match. She's saying the same thing in gesture and speech. Compare her to this one. She says exactly the same thing. I added the 5 and the 4 and the 3. But watch carefully. Watch her hands, because what she does is she points at that other 5 over there first, and then the 5 and the 4 and the 3. So with her hands, she's talking about adding up all of the numbers in the problem. With her mouth, she's only talking about adding up the numbers on the left side of the problem. Here she goes.
How did you get 12?
I added 5, and then the 4, and then the 3.
All right.
Okay, and she's produced what we're calling a mismatch. In speech, she's talking about adding up the numbers to the equal sign. Gesture, she's talking about adding up all the numbers. We again gave them all instruction. None of them knew how to solve the problem. What you see here is the same data for conservation that I presented before. There's the data for mathematical equivalence, the same phenomenon. The children who were mismatchers prior to instruction, the ones in blue, learned more than the children who are matchers prior to instruction, the ones in white. Okay, so gesturing reflects what speakers know. And notice now here, it's not just gesturing or no gesturing, because they're all gesturing. It's the information being conveyed in gesture and how it relates to the child's speech, right? So this really suggests that gesture is conveying substantive information. But gesturing can also change what we know. And in order to really explore that, we're going to have to manipulate what the gestures are that the children produce. So this is a study done by Susan Wagner-Cook. We taught one group of children to say, I want to make one side equal to the other side, which is the equalizer strategy, and that is how you solve this problem, basically. And they're told to say these words before and after they solved each problem in the training set. Okay, here's an example.
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
Okay, now can you put your answer?
Another group, we told them to say exactly the same words, but we forced them, or actually we encourage them, we don't force anybody really, let that be noted. We told them to produce a grouping strategy, to put the V hand under the 3 and the 2, and then point at the blank, because that is one way to solve the problem. So they did that while saying the words that we told them to do. Here we go.
So first of all, can you say the words and do the hand movements exactly like we practiced?
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
Okay, now can you put your hand?
Okay, and then we gave them instruction, and we looked to see what happened, and this is what happened. The children who produced gesture and speech solved significantly more problems than the children who produced speech alone, which suggests that just by moving their hands in this way, and notice it's sort of a mismatch that we made them do, because they're talking about equivalence, but they're gesturing this grouping strategy. And that worked really well to encourage their learning. Okay, so big question, why does gesturing change our minds? It's nice that it does, but why does it? So one of our ideas is that gesturing really, it's an act, it's a behavioral act, and it's grounded in the real world. But it's special. It's a special kind of act in that it represents information. So for example, if I take a bottle, my little water bottle here, and I act on it, I can get the bottle open by doing an action. But if I sit here and gesture over it, the bottle is never, ever getting open unless one of you takes pity on me and runs up and opens the bottle for me. It's representing information that can be conveyed in a communicative way. So gesture has this really special status. It's grounded in concrete action, but it also has a leg in representation. And so we thought maybe what gesture can do is take kids from understanding something really concretely and help them transition to understanding something in a more abstract way. So we gave them input that would do that for them. We gave them the same words. I want to make one side equal to the other side, and we taught them movements that varied in how grounded in action they were, either action themselves, concrete gesture, or abstract gesture. Here's an example of the action. They were literally told to pick up the objects and move them. Okay, the concrete gesture, they got exactly the same strategy, but they can't pick up the objects.
Equal to the another side. Okay.
And the last one is abstract gesture, which is the gesture you saw before, just to indicate with a V.
One side equal to the other side.
Okay, so these kids now do this all during training, and then we tested them. None of them knew how to solve the problem to begin with. We tested them first on problems that were very close to what we trained them on. So they're trained on a problem, 5 plus 7 plus 4 equals blank plus 4. And they're tested on problems that basically are exactly the same, but with different numbers. And what happens? It turns out that all three groups perform at pretty much the same level. These are children who were in the action condition in white, concrete gesture in blue, and abstract gesture in red. And you can see there's no significant differences among these groups. Any one of these strategies, any one of these behaviors helps the children learn. It gets more interesting, though, when we make the task a little harder. So they were trained on this problem, 5 plus 7 plus 4 equals blank plus 4, but then we got tricky and we moved the blank. Notice that if you move the blank, you can no longer just mindlessly add up the first two numbers and put it in the blank. You have to do something a little bit more thoughtful, okay? And now what happens is that children who are trained with action just drop off. They can't generalize in this way. They can learn it, but they can't generalize it. Meanwhile, children in the concrete condition, concrete gesture, and in the abstract gesture condition did just fine. And then finally, our last little tricky thing is that we took out the equal addends entirely. And now, you can't just be grouping anything. You really have to understand mathematical equivalence in order to solve this problem. And what we found here is action never came back. Concrete gesture is actually now starting to fade off, but abstract gesture works just fine. So this is pretty interesting because it suggests that action helps children learn the problems on which they're taught. But it's not so great for generalizing beyond those problems. Gesture is much better for that. Now, of course, when we teach people things, we want them not just to learn this, we want them to be able to generalize and transfer. And what we're suggesting, or what these findings suggest, is that gesture is really good for that. And we're now replicating that in a word learning study as well. So we still need to figure out the brain mechanisms, the mechanisms that are underlying this. And we're now trying to do this using fMRI. Because it turns out, if you've learned this problem by moving your hands, by gesturing, and later on we stick you in a scanner, and we ask you just to solve the problems, no movements, no actions, whatever, your brain areas that are activated are motor. Much more so than if you learn the problem only by speech alone. So what this suggests is that gesture has a signature, a motor signature, that sticks with you after you've learned the problem. It's sort of you are where you've been, and how you learn the problem is affecting how you process these problems later on. So, given that we find motor activation in these areas, that allows us to sort of begin to explore two hypotheses which might be possible to explain why learning from gesture generalizes and learning from action doesn't. Because learning for action possibly just ties you to the object. It ties you to those particular objects, ties you to this particular word. It just sort of concretizes it. And if that's true, then maybe we'll find activation in object perception areas for the action condition, but not for the gesture condition. In contrast, learning from gesture extends the representation to a more abstract form, and so we might find activation in frontal areas for the gesture condition and not for the action condition. And in fact, both of these hypotheses might be true. That's sort of what we're hoping, but we'll see what happens when we get some data. Okay, so language is resilient. When it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands. Gesture is resilient. It comes for free with speech, and it helps us think. Now, I want to bring you full circle. Because if gesture is so resilient, signers should do it too, right? And it turns out they do. So here, this is work that Jenny Liu and James Waller are doing right now. And we're trying to put people in situations where they are likely to gesture. So we ask speakers to describe objects that are so similar. Words are hard, or you can't really use words to capture the differences. So if I asked you to describe those two vases, you might say there are two yellow vases, and then you'd start to talk about the bumps and whatever, and you might start to gesture as this next speaker does. Here's a hearing guy just describing these things.
In the middle and at the bottom.
Okay, and he's gesturing. Well, it turns out that in exactly the same situation, signers do it too. So here's a signer describing the same vases. Okay, but what's really interesting about the signer that some of you noticed already because you're already laughing is that signers not only gesture with their hands, but they also gesture with their mouths. No hearing person that we've ever found is doing a watch him again. He's great. He's just terrific. So we're exploring this further. But the big question that I want to address now is whether gesturing in signers has the same cognitive effects in signers as they have in speakers. And answering this question actually allows us to disentangle a very sticky theoretical question that we just can't disentangle by looking at hearing people. You have to go to signers. Because why does gesturing lead to change? Well, one possibility is that gesturing leads to change because we have two modalities here. We have an oral modality, we have a manual modality. Putting them together at the same moment in solving a problem may be terrific for learning and for understanding. And if so, it's not going to work for signers because they're gesturing and signing in only one modality, the manual modality. On the other hand, gesture offers a second representational format. And that might be important. So, speech and sign are discrete, categorical. They describe things in a particularly segmented way. Gesture, on the other hand, is much more analog and mimetic. So perhaps it's putting together this mimetic code with this more analog code, and that's what's really important in making gesture a wonderful tool for learning. And if so, then it should work for signers. Okay, so we asked two questions. Do signers produce gesture-sign mismatches? What is a gesture-sign mismatch? And do those mismatches predict readiness to learn? So we're going to go back to mathematical equivalence, and I'm going to show you a deaf child using sign and matching gesture. So here's our famous problem again. She does it wrong, and she adds all the numbers in the problem, and she signs it first. She says add all, signs, add all. But watch her gestures. Then what she does is she does bonk, 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 bonk. She points at the four numbers, and she does a slidey gesture under the four numbers. So she's using both sign and gesture. Okay, just to deconstruct that for you because it's fast. In the sign strategy, she first does add all numbers. And then in her gestures, she sweeps from the left 3 to the right 3, and she points at these four numbers. Okay, so turns out deaf children gesture on 80% of the problems that they were given. Is that a lot or a little? Who knows? So we tried to go back to our hearing kids to assess whether this is a lot or a little. And it turns out it's pretty comparable. Hearing children gesture on 73% of the problems. Now the crucial question is, can we find mismatches? So here is a gesture-sign mismatch. What the child does is she adds up the numbers on the left side of the problem, and she says so in her signs, and she puts the answer in the blank. But while she's doing that, she's using this little gesture over here to cover the 7, to sort of take it away. Okay? So here you go. Okay. So she's in her sign, she's doing add and put, add to equal sign strategy. But in her gestures, she's sort of indicating what you can add up, but also doing this take away gesture, which is an add subtract, and it's different information from her speech. Okay, so the proportion of kids who produce these mismatches, 42%, a lot or little, hard to know, but it's pretty comparable to what hearing kids do. But now, of course, is the crucial question. Okay, we get gesture-sign mismatches. Do they do the cognitive work that a gesture-speech mismatch does? So what we've done is to array on the bottom here all of the children as a function of how many gesture-sign mismatches they produced prior to instruction. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on to 6. And what I'm going to show you is the proportion of children in each one of those bins who went from understanding 0, solving 0 problems correctly to start, to solving 5 or 6 problems correcting at the end. Now, if mismatch is predicting learning, what we should find is that those kids who are producing 6 matches should learn much more often than the kids who are producing 1. And that is just what we find. It's really a very pretty picture suggesting that mismatch, gesture-sign mismatch, is serving the same functions as gesture-speech mismatch. And in fact, just to put it in the terms that I showed you before, here's the data from the hearing kids that I showed you originally, and here's the data from the deaf kids in exactly the same format, and there it is. They look pretty comparable. Okay, so gesture-sign mismatch predicts learning as well as gesture-speech mismatch, and what that suggests is that it's the juxtaposition of these two different representational formats. It's not just hand in mouth. It's really hand in hand as long as those two hands are representing information in different ways that gives gesture its power. Okay? And moreover, gesture serves the same cognitive functions for signers as it does for speakers, which makes it a really interesting thing to explore. So, language is resilient, comes out of the mouth, when it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands. Gesture is resilient, it comes for free along with language, not only speech, but also sign, and it helps us think. So, let me pull this all together and tell you what I think the arc of my work has found. So what can our hands tell us about how we talk and think? So I have to, little caveat here, home sign is really not the first step in language evolution. These are children with modern day brains. This is not how language evolved initially. But what home signers do can provide input, insight into the kinds of properties, linguistic properties, that children will bring to language learning, even if they have no model for it. So what I'm sort of suggesting here is that if we got rid of language, but didn't get rid of people, language is gone, people are still around, people then had to reinvent language, I'm suggesting it will look exactly the same as the language that we've constructed already, that home signers will bring to that situation. Now, when it starts getting complex, it may start looking different because there's cultural evolution. But it will look exactly the same as these properties that are found in home sign. And it's interesting because this isn't true of all of our cultural artifacts. So for example, take number. Number was invented once. And if we lost number today, we might not get it back. We'd need all of those opportunities just to fall in the right place for us to get number back. And we know that, in fact, home signers actually can't do number. They can do language, but they can't do number, suggesting that in some ways language is more resilient than number. Okay, so third point, the emergence of sign language from home sign allows us to take these to see how far kids can get from the rudiments and how it develops into these fully fledged languages that we call our own. Okay, and finally, gesturing is a robust part of language, speech or sign, and it plays a role in learning. And more importantly, I think, in generalizing what we learn, since that's really what's important about learning. So now I want to just end by saying that the tricky part, some of you may have noticed this already, for sign language is really deciding where sign stops and gesture begins. And that's a question that our Center for Gesture, Sign, and Language that we have established here at the university is tackling. It cuts across social sciences and the humanities, cuts across many departments, and frankly, this is such a hard problem that we're going to need all of them in order to help us solve this problem. So let me finally thank my many collaborators whose little heads you've seen popping up throughout.